Chapter 4 Frightening Episodes. After her mirror expedition, Delwyn finished recording her experiences in her journal and fell asleep. She didn't hear Gwen come in to check on her, and it was lucky that she'd hidden the journal in the bottom of her suitcase before she went to bed. That night she didn't dream or have any nightmares, which she was grateful for, but she did wonder when Varun would send her a sign and what the sign would be. She also wondered if she'd be able to tell if it was a sign from him, and if she was mistaken, if she would get into trouble for going back into the mirror without a proper invitation. 1 week later, early in the morning, she was sitting having breakfast when her aunt said the thing she didn't want to hear. "Well, I know you don't want to, but I think you shouldn't wait to start therapy, Del." Delwyn stiffened and sat up. "I'll be fine, I promise." Gwen regarded her with kind but stern eyes. "It's not a matter of being able to control it now, is it?" Delwyn appreciated Gwen's wisdom, although she tried to explain. "But I think I've got a grip on my situation now, and being here is helping. The fresh air, healthy eating, better outlook on life. Besides, my narcolepsy isn't so bad. The episodes, I mean." "But they're happening a lot more frequently now, aren't they, love?" Her auntie reached out and stroked her cheek before Delwyn shook her head, trying to appear like she was in control of herself. "I don't want therapy. I don't think I need it. Besides, it doesn't stop the hallucinations, and the pills only keep them at bay for a short time. Anyway, it costs too much." Gwen sighed and gently pulled rank. "Well, that's what your pension is for. We can't have you getting worse and worse while you're trying to forge a life for yourself. You shouldn't even be on a disability pension. Girlie, you're not disabled. I don't know how they granted you that." Delwyn gritted her teeth in defiance as she did her best to hold her temper. "I'm sorry, but my pension is my business, Auntie Gwen. I'll earn my keep working around here, so I think I should have the final say on what my pension gets spent on." Delwyn jumped in shock when Gwen slapped the table in frustration with both hands. It was obvious that the older woman couldn't help the words that came out next. "Girlie, I took you in even though I didn't have to." Delwyn collapsed into a surprising fit of sobs, her hands covering her face as she leaned forward to rest her forehead onto the tabletop. She managed to splutter between sobs. "Then kick me out, I don't care." Gwen sighed and sat back in her chair. She stated quietly, "Oh, Del, I'm sorry, love." Delwyn's sobbing eased down a little after a few more seconds, and she slowly lifted her head. Looking over at her aunt, she realised that she was being defiant and difficult. Taking the tissues Gwen passed to her, she blew her nose like a raging trumpet, making them both laugh. Delwyn finally said, "I'm acting like a precocious child." Gwen smiled. "Yes, you are." She gently growled with mock severity and a furrowed brow. She smoothed back some of her own stray hair into her bun and said calmly as she smiled, "Well, we can talk about it later. I have to go and do the milking." Delwyn heaved herself up from the table and went to get dressed so she could go and help. It was nearly 5 a.m. and they were already late. The birds were chirping loudly and the sun bled across the fields, illuminating everything in a golden haze. On the way, they passed the granny flat, walking down the dusty driveway. Delwyn felt a thrill going up her spine, but she knew that she had to keep her secret or the spell would be broken. She realised that in order to stay close to the mirror and to maintain access, she needed to appease her aunt and agree to therapy. "I'm sorry about being so stubborn about the therapy. I'll go, of course." This obviously pleased Gwen immensely. "Wonderful! You really should go, sweetie. I promise you won't regret it. We'll find someone much better than that Dr. Boyd." She threw her arm around Delwyn's waist and they walked happily along the road, meeting up with Greg, who was waiting for them at the gate to the milking sheds. Delwyn noticed that it seemed like he had a halo around his sandy hair in the misty light. He smiled his wide smile and said, "You two are bright and bushy-tailed this morning." They greeted him with laughter. Then the three of them launched into the morning's work, with the magpies warbling their daily song. Later on, Delwyn went for a nap, thanks to the medication making her drowsy. She then awoke from a deep sleep, having dreamt that she had been floating in the Pearl boat again, but this time it was heading towards a black planet and she was afraid. She didn't remember any more details and wondered if it was a sign from Varun. She went back to sleep after 20 minutes and didn't dream again. When she woke up later that afternoon, she found a note on the kitchen table from Gwen stating that she had gone to help Greg with his father. The opportunity to check out the mirror was ripe, and even though she wasn't sure if the previous dream was an actual sign from Varun, she thought she'd risk it anyway. What harm could there possibly be? She quickly ran out the back and along the side of the house, past the old milking sheds and through the bushes to the flat and straight through the door, slamming it behind her. More debris fell on the floor. She winced and felt like a naughty child, but then she continued walking towards the mirror, and as she approached it she felt a strange sense of foreboding. Something was telling her not to go near it, but something stubborn inside her pushed her forward. She slowly crept up to it and pulled the curtain off. She saw dark clouds in the reflection. She turned around to check the window opposite, but the sky was an azure blue. She turned back to the mirror and inched closer, wondering why she couldn't see her reflection. When she was only a few inches away from the surface of the mirror, she noticed the clouds getting darker and moving faster, rolling around with a sound of distant thunder and flashes of lightning here and there. The fear was mounting inside her, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She leaned in a little closer and saw the clouds part, and without warning, a black streak shot out towards her. She leaned back and realized that it was a hand, but it was too late. It grabbed her face and she could feel the cold, wet fingers digging into her cheeks, trying to drag her in. She screamed, but it was muffled. As her face was squashed, she felt sharp pain from the fingertips travel throughout her head. Strangely enough, she could also hear owls hooting and dogs howling. She grabbed onto the frame of the mirror and pulled for all she was worth, but the hand had a tight grip on her. All she could see was the pitch-black palm over her face and the dark arm leading back to the clouds, with thick veins like old tree roots sticking up, pulsing in rhythm with the thunder. The smell of death permeated her being. She could also smell something like formaldehyde, which reminded her of a funeral home mixed in with incense. The fingers were clenching her face so hard it felt like they were going to tear it from her skull. She struggled and pulled with all her might, her stifled screams gurgling out of her swollen mouth. With one last yank, she twisted her head and finally fell backwards onto the floor, her face hot and feeling bruised already. As she sat bewildered and whimpering in disbelief, the hand clenched into a gnarled fist and slowly withdrew into the clouds, which dissipated over the next few seconds, revealing her mirror image as if nothing had happened. Delwyn saw that there were absolutely no marks on her face, but she was too scared to take a closer look. She got up and scrambled to get out, feeling like her face had been forced through a meat grinder. As she ran back to the house, her mind was racing with questions and responses as to why she'd been attacked. Was she supposed to stay away until Varun summoned her and was getting close to the mirror asking for trouble? Was she being punished for her behaviour towards Gwen? Was there something else that she wasn't aware of? The only thing she knew for sure was that she would not be going back to the mirror in a hurry. That thought made her sad but safe at the same time. When she got back to her room, she lay on her bed and contemplated the events, wondering what to do. It took an hour before her face stopped hurting. It was all she could do to stop thinking of her parents. The tears were right there under the surface, but she distracted herself by thinking about the mirror and then Varun and Greg, thinking about anything that was completely alien to her history. She crawled under the covers and noticed Peter outside in the patio. He was curled up in the big old planter, sleeping as usual. As she drifted off, she thought to herself how wonderful it must be to live without a care in the world. The next thing she knew, she was dreaming again. However, she didn't exactly know what she was dreaming, or that she was dreaming. She was walking through one of the paddocks at Magpie Meadows, listening to the birds and cicadas, enjoying the sun and making daisy chains as she walked along. In the distance she could see Greg on a motorbike, rounding up the cattle. She yelled out to him and waved. He waved back, turned the bike around and made his way towards her. When he got close, he stopped the bike and climbed off, but left the helmet on. Delwyn ran up to him and jumped into his arms. They hugged and he spun her around, making her giddy with the speed. She giggled and yelled for him to stop. It was so perfect that it seemed as though it was a scene from a romance novel. He let her down on the ground and she grabbed his hand, trying to lead him to the house, but he wouldn't follow. Without talking, he kept gesturing for her to go the other way with him. She became stubborn and playfully pulled him back, but he wouldn't have it. After some back and forth, he let go and she noticed that he was floating away, not walking. She yelled out, "Greg, why aren't you walking?" He didn't look back, but he kept floating away, so she ran after him. It was then that she noticed a familiar sound, hissing, but it wasn't the cicadas. She stopped and looked around, but couldn't see what it was. She was still in the paddock at Magpie Meadows, near the dairy shed, and the dams were kicking up a fuss. She tried to calm them down by saying, "It's not a snake, it's okay, ladies," just like Uncle Sean used to say. But they kept bellowing and running amok until she saw Greg again, floating along the line of cypress. She chased after him, yelling, "Greg, stop!" He stopped and landed on the ground, then turned. The hissing also stopped. Then the visor on his helmet opened by itself. It was Varun. Shocked, she yelled, "Varun, what have you done with Greg?" "Silly woman," he snarled. "This is a dream." He snapped his fingers in front of her face and fire leapt from his hands. She yelled in horror and fell back, tripping over a turtle. When she landed on her backside, she realised that the whole paddock was filled with turtles, all green and blending into the landscape. She looked up at Varun, who was back in his seahorse form, but without the helmet. He floated towards Delwyn, with flames still shooting out of his hands, yet he smiled warmly, and she hoped he didn't mean her any harm, even though she was afraid of the fire. The turtles kept bumping into her, which was distracting, but she had to keep her eyes on Varun. He finally spoke. "I've been sending you signs. You're so slow. What a slow coach." She was confused and said, "What do you mean? What signs?" He started rolling the fire between his hands like he was playing with liquid or smoke. Then his eyes became fire. "Can't you take a hint?" She tried to think hard, but was distracted even further, with the turtles still bumping their heads against her, and his fiery eyes were terrifying. "No, I can't remember. What are you talking about?" One of the turtles bit her on the hand. "Ouch!" she yelped. When she tried to smack the head, it pulled into the shell. Varun laughed. He started circling her, dropping a handful of fire on the turtles here and there. When she was surrounded by fiery turtles, he yelled loudly as the hissing returned. "You really are dense!" Delwyn started screaming in terror. "Stop it! Stop it, please! Why are you doing this to me?" He roared. "I'm testing your metal! Ha!" One by one, the turtles morphed into fiery, leaping people. She could hear Varun laughing louder and louder as the hissing became deafening. The fire people took over the circling until all Delwyn could see was a bright red tornado swirling around her. Her screams were drowned out by the horrendous roar that the combined hissing and laughing were making. She curled up in a ball at the bottom of the fire tunnel when all of a sudden she heard Gwen saying, Del, it's all right, love." She slowly looked up and realised that she was now in her room, on the floor next to her bed. The dogs were barking and trying to lick her face. She sat up and cried as Gwen cradled her, rocking her back and forth. The dogs started barking again, and Gwen yelled, "Shush!" They shut up and ran back to check on Delwyn, who was still whimpering in her aunt's arms, but she felt bad for being such a disruptive burden. "It's okay," she sniffed, wiping away the tears. "I'm sorry to be so much trouble." She started weeping again. "Delwyn, you're the daughter I never had. I'd do anything for you, love. Don't ever think that it's too much, okay?" She nodded and let her aunt hug her until she felt better. Slowly the dogs wandered out of the room and Peter came slinking in. He jumped up and snuggled next to her on the bed, for his turn to console her. "Better late than never, right?" said Gwen, trying to brighten the mood. Delwyn smiled and squeezed him to her. "He's my partner in crime." She looked down at him and saw the twinkle in his feline eyes. They laughed and went to eat dinner. They discussed the therapist Gwen had arranged for her to attend the following week at Sea Spray. She wasn't looking forward to it, but smiled as though it wasn't an issue. Anything to keep the peace. The following week, they were heading off to Sea Spray for Delwyn's first session with Dr. Purdieu. It was a stormy summer's day. The daily chores were done and the cows were fed. Gwen had done some research through a trusted doctor in town, and they'd been advised that he specialised in dissociative disorders as well as many others that related to Delwyn's particular issues. Delwyn had only half listened to her aunt prattle on about his credentials and history, due to the fact that as far as she was concerned, they were all the same. She thought back over her history with the variety of counsellors, psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists and so on that she'd seen. The only doctor she had ever held much regard for was her neurologist in Melbourne. He was the one who discovered that she had the lesion in her right temporal lobe, and that, when they checked the EEG, they found that she'd virtually had zero activity in her right brain. They had all been mystified by that, but she hadn't understood why it was such a big deal. They had told her that the most of her activity in her brain was in the left hemisphere, but it didn't shed any light on why she was having such severe hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations. It certainly hadn't made her feel any better, but at least she knew she wasn't crazy. She at least liked to think that she wasn't. It still hadn't explained the astral travelling, but they disregarded those experiences as synapses misfiring. They'd asked her questions such as, "Do you binge eat?" and "Do you feel like you're under psychic attack?" Astral travelling was a no-no, but psychic attack was A-OK. She remembered the nutty social worker that she'd seen when she was a teenager. When she'd arrived at the community centre, she saw the same kind of posters on the walls that all of those places had. She'd hated the mock, easygoing atmosphere and the hippie social worker do-gooder mentality of the garden variety counsellors. She knew that she was being harsh and that they just wanted to help. She also knew that she needed help. A previous counsellor had said in exasperation, "If nothing else, surely you'd agree that coping skills would be beneficial, Delwyn?" She'd been childish and stubborn when she'd retorted, "I have my own coping skills, I don't need your New Age crap." She tried to forget those times and to focus on being positive. Thinking back, she remembered that after she'd signed in, she sat in the waiting room with two other women. One was reading a Bible and weeping into a handkerchief, and the other was staring out of the window watching children playing on the monkey bars. She remembered Uncle Sean talking about degrees on the back of cornflakes packets and tried not to laugh out loud. Then she'd heard a door open and a slim woman came down the hallway towards her, smiling and friendly. She was very New Age, with short, spiky blonde hair. From her ears hung big, swinging, tribal earrings, and she was wearing an oversized, hairy sweater and bag lady skirt with pixie boots. She looked like she should have been playing a flute and riding a snail or sitting on top of a toadstool. "Hello! You must be Delwyn!" The woman staring out of the window had said softly, Delwyn, without tearing her gaze away from the children playing. Delwyn got up and tiptoed past the women and stretched her hand out to shake the counsellor's hand. "Yes, I'm Delwyn. Hello." The woman repeated her name again, still staring out of the window. "Delwyn." The social worker squeezed her eyes shut and wrinkled her nose as if to say, "Don't mind her," and ushered her along the highway. "I'm Zoe, just taking you along here to my office." Delwyn had noticed that Zoe overpronounced S and spoke like she was reading a fairy tale to a child. She knew that it was going to be a headache. Zoe led her into a room that was small, stuffy and sad. There was a basket of orphan toys next to the sorry little bookcase that held old, typical tomes with titles such as You, Me, Us, or Family Planning in the 90s, and Loving Your Life Even If You're Losing. Zoe had asked Delwyn if she wanted some juice or a glass of water. "No thanks, I'm fine." "But are you really?" asked Zoe, smiling down her nose with a knowing look as though she'd had one up on her already. Zoe was one of those counsellors that clasped her hands under her chin when she talked and had regarded Delwyn with a rehearsed look of supposed wisdom. Delwyn had tried not to be a smart-ass and had done her best to behave. Zoe also liked to do things like lean back in her chair, make sympathetic cooing noises, shake her head and furrow her brow. Delwyn had pretended to listen while Zoe drew graphs with bubbles that represented the issues she'd assumed Delwyn was dealing with. Zoe had seemed very proud of her graph and kept pointing with a special pointer at different bubbles, saying at intervals, "So you see," and "if we look here," as well as "it all makes sense if," trying to wrap it all up in a nutshell to make herself rather than Delwyn feel better. Delwyn had noticed that Zoe did a lot of assuming and hadn't asked many questions. She was now used to doctors and counsellors asking small questions and sitting back, waiting for a response or asking things like, "How does that make you feel?" or "What do you want to focus on?" Zoe had told Delwyn what she should feel and what she would want to talk about and how she should progress. Also, she'd started almost every sentence with, "Delwyn." The hour had dragged on, but Delwyn had amused herself by daydreaming and wondering how she could avoid her mother when she got home. Before long, Zoe perked up even more and said, "Well, that's it for this week. Same time next week?" On their way out, Zoe had said, "Oh, hang on, Poppet, you forgot your chart." With that, she'd skipped off on her tippy toes and came back, half skipping, half running, waving the chart in the air triumphantly, which Delwyn begrudgingly accepted, doing her best not to throw it in the trash on her way out. How she hoped that Dr. Purdieu would be a cut above that fairy. Gwen jolted her out of her daydreaming. "I think this doctor will be the one, you know." Delwyn asked, "The one?" Gwen nodded. "Yes, you know, the one who can help you." Delwyn nodded and smiled. "What's his name again?" Her aunt took the last turn from the main road into Seaspray and said, "His name is Dr. Alain Purdieu." "Sounds French, is it?" She tried to sound interested. "I think so. He's supposed to be very experienced, well-travelled too." Gwen snuck a sideways glance at Delwyn to see if her niece was going to play along. She was. "Oh, that's nice," she smiled at her aunt convincingly. He lived on the 90-mile beach, which Delwyn had fond memories of. She'd stayed there many times as a child in Uncle Sean's holiday house, which they'd sold after he'd passed away. Driving down the main road, Delwyn saw the familiar beach houses, including the one with shells plastered all over it and the high, grass-covered hummocks that led to the pristine seashore. She had a mind to ditch the session and go and play on the beach. Pulling into the doctor's driveway, she saw that it was a modest brick home with a well-tended garden. There were tea-tree bushes along the front of the property, serving as a fence, and a covered front veranda with a variety of wind chimes. Before they got out of the car, Gwen turned to her and said, "Now, I've had a little talk with the doctor about your troubles, just so you know, love." Delwyn raised her eyebrows, but then nodded and smiled to let her know it was okay. Her aunt continued, "He just wanted a little background from my point of view, but anything you tell him is confidential. He won't feed it back to me, unless he thinks you're in some kind of danger. Okay, love?" Delwyn reached over and hugged her aunt tightly. "It's okay. I love you." Gwen returned the hug, then patted her on the back. "I love you too, dear. Now I'm going for a walk on the beach. When you're done, come and get me." Delwyn said, "Okay," and jumped out of the car. A man opened the front door of the house and came down the steps, past the tidy rows of red azaleas, and down the walkway. He was tall, with a slim build, and seemed like he could have been from anywhere on the planet. He had short black hair with dark olive skin and a wide, bright smile with perfect teeth. Gwen yelled out, "Hello! I hope you don't mind if I leave my car here and take a walk along the beach until you're done." He waved her away and nodded as he replied, "No problem at all, Gwen. We'll be fine." Delwyn noticed that he had a slight French accent. He motioned for Delwyn to come in and extended his hand as Gwen made her way across the road to the beach. "Hello, Delwyn." She was a little put out by her aunt leaving her so quickly and dumping her with this strange man, but she was also mesmerised by the voice. It was smooth, soft and deep. She took his hand and shook it. "Yes, I'm Delwyn, Dr. Purdieu." She got it wrong. She winced, but corrected herself straight away. "I mean, Dr. Purdieu." He let out a throaty laugh and shook his head. "Don't worry, I get that all the time, but you can call me Ellen if you prefer." She felt strange addressing such a distinguished man by his first name, but the idea of getting his name wrong again was too embarrassing. "Only if it's okay with you." "Of course, I don't stand by any pomp and circumstance. It's silly, isn't it?" "Yes," was all she could muster. She felt young and foolish in his presence, but not due to his putting on airs and graces. She felt that his intelligence was palpable. It oozed from him. As he led her into the house, she could see the typical pieces of art you would expect to see in a psychotherapist's home. There were masks on the walls from various cultures, statues depicting different life events, stone animals, paintings, some obscure and some so blatant that they made her blush. He smiled and apologised, leading her into the study, saying, "Avert your eyes if you need to." She laughed nervously and followed him to a serene space that seemed perfect for introspection. The room was decorated with neutral tones and had exposed beams and many windows that looked out over magnificent trees and ferns. There were shelves holding expensive and intelligent-looking books, all neatly arranged to a level of anal perfection. She chose a simple black couch that had a cream-coloured throw rug on it. He sat opposite her on a plush armchair next to an antique mahogany side table that already had a glass of water, a pad and a pen on it. The simple black coffee table between them had a jug of water and 2 glasses on it, as well as a box of tissues. She also noticed a stack of strange magazines on the end, called 14 Times. He gently took the pad and pen and rested back in his chair, waiting for her to begin. This made her nervous, so she started shifting about, trying not to giggle. She wanted to tell him that she didn't know what to do, but felt it would make her sound silly. He was studying her like a father might study his child doing something for the first time. They both laughed and he broke the ice. "This might seem strange to you, Delwyn, but my methods are quite unorthodox. I don't like to lead the patient. I have some idea why you're here. However, I want you to be the one to tell me what you want, why you're here, what you want from me. Tell me how I can help you." He smiled reassuringly to let her know that he wasn't rushing her. She sat like a dumb animal. She expected him to lead. She wanted him to know exactly what was wrong and to provide all the answers, but how could he? He only knew the half of it. She could have kicked herself for not bringing her journal. He jolted her out of her thoughts by asking, "What are you thinking, right at this moment?" She froze, then thawed into laughter. He also laughed, but pressed on. "No, really, what were you thinking about when I asked?" Staring down at her hands, she mumbled feebly, "I was thinking I should have brought my journal." They both laughed again, and the doctor scribbled something on his pad. She wondered what he was writing. Without looking up, he said, "If you had your journal here, what would be the first entry you would want me to read?" He wrote for a little longer, then looked up at Delwyn to see her frowning and looking around the room in confusion. She was trying to think about what she would let him see. The parts about the mirror were definitely out of bounds. She attempted to articulate her thoughts aloud. "Well, I do have a lot to discuss. I've been having a lot of nightmares. I have trouble sleeping. I'm coming from a broken marriage and having a strange relationship with my parents. I have sleep disorders, nightmares, and stuff." They laughed, but Delwyn started to feel uncomfortable all of a sudden, as though the cat was out of the bag. She became even more uncomfortable when he continued looking at her without speaking. So she went on, her mouth on autopilot. "I'm really interested in the individuation process. I want to get a handle on all this so that I can move on. I want to integrate everything so I can be whole." She was suddenly proud of herself for being able to spell it all out. She thought she sounded quite intelligent and looked over at Dr. Purdieu, who had stopped writing and was staring at her almost in disbelief. This made her feel odd. She asked, "Did I say something wrong?" He cleared his throat, took off his glasses and polished them with a clean tissue. Then he put them back on and peered at Delwyn as though she was quite mad. "Delwyn, permit me to be quite frank, if I may," he smiled, exasperated but retaining his calm demeanour. Delwyn nodded, wide-eyed and eager to hear whatever he would say. He continued, "You have given me quite a loaded laundry list of issues." He trailed off, regarding her with concern, but continuing nonetheless. "And what concerns me the most is that two of the biggest issues of all, your divorce and your issues with your parents, were sandwiched in there amongst all the other things, almost as though you didn't want to face them and forgive me for sounding trite." He nodded as though trying to gain her consent. She gave it by nodding enthusiastically, although not enjoying what she was hearing. He went on, "It's as though you are deliberately putting the divorce in a place where it can be lost or maybe drowned in a sea of troubles so that you don't have to face it. Does that sound feasible to you?" Delwyn looked down at the carpet. "Somewhat," she said finally, aware that she might as well agree for now. She wasn't sure what she expected, and something about the way he spoke made her feel like a child, or at least like her level of intelligence was subpar in comparison. Dr. Purdieu watched as Delwyn shifted in her chair, never settling for more than a minute at a time, and finally asked, "Would you prefer the couch?" She glanced over at the unassuming beige sofa. It had a plush crimson throw rug casually folded at the end of it. She frowned and looked back at the doctor and shook her head. "No thanks, I'm fine." "All right then." He clasped his slow, gentle hands together, and with his legs crossed and clipboard balancing on his lap, he asked, "Would you like to tell me about how you and your ex-husband met? What was his name?" "Duncan," she said flatly, uncomfortable with saying his name out loud. He watched Delwyn passively, obviously waiting to see if she would continue. She didn't want to discuss her marriage, as she hated giving Duncan airtime, not that he was there to gloat or interject. She felt the familiar anxiety creep over her with just the mention of his name. Dr. Purdieu could see that she was uncomfortable, as she pulled her legs up under herself and hugged the cushion tighter to her chest. "Does it make you uncomfortable talking about him?" he asked, casually lowering his voice to a mild purr, showing that he meant no harm. She nodded, but then curled her lip a little to let him know that there was a side to her that still resented that part of her life. "Was there ever any physical abuse?" His voice was cajoling, but he had a feeling, obviously, that it would take a bit longer for her to open up. She responded with a flat "no," and waited for further questions. She'd decided that she wanted to explore her issues in private in the dream world and not with some strange male doctor. Dr. Purdieu uncrossed his legs and moved around in his seat. "What about emotional or verbal abuse?" She nodded readily, but then became angry with herself for responding so quickly and folded her arms across her chest as a sign of closing up. Even though it was akin to pulling teeth, Dr. Purdieu continued. "Was he controlling?" Delwyn realised that this form of questioning would take forever, and she didn't want to spend all her time with him doing the nodding dog routine, so she opened up to stave off boredom and to get things moving. "I met Duncan at work. He kept asking me to go out with him over several months until finally I said yes, although I can't remember why. Out of pity maybe, but I think he expected that I was somebody else or something else." She glanced over at Dr. Purdieu, who was nodding and writing. Then he looked over at her to see why she'd paused. She surmised that he would say, "Go on." Instead, he asked, "What or who do you think he was expecting?" Without thinking, she said, "A mother, a whore, who knows?" They were both surprised, but she was the one who laughed first. Then he asked, "Did you ever talk about it? I mean, how was your communication?" He tapped his pen against his chin slowly and studied her with interest. All of a sudden she felt exposed, turned inside out. "It was stultified. We were like opposing forces. It was like we were both on different elevators, or something." She didn't feel that it was a satisfactory answer, but he nodded and said, "I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go on." She unfolded her arms and sat up in her chair, trying to get to the point. "I had been living on my own and I was happy, relatively happy, but before I knew it I was married and expected to be a wife." Dr. Purdieu continued nodding and taking notes, and somehow she felt stupid and unimportant or boring, but continued obediently. "I didn't want children, but he did." Dr. Purdieu interrupted. "Why not?" She felt her temper snap. "Why should I?" He shrugged and asked, "Why get married? Did you love him?" She hated that question, even if it was obviously important. Dr. Boyd had asked it many times, and Delwyn had responded differently every time it was asked, with answers such as maybe, or no, or I think so, or I don't think so, or even definitely not, or I hope not. Each answer had resulted in a different discussion that Delwyn felt was of no consequence. Dr. Boyd had always told her that her attitude towards love was very important. How she received or rejected it denoted how she felt and how deeply she wanted to escape. Chasing a high was the same as yearning for love, whether sexual or otherwise, and seeing as her mother had been so cold and mean and her father so distant and unavailable, it was obvious why she had found it so easy to be so ambivalent. She looked at Dr. Purdieu's feline face and felt bad for snapping. "I don't think I ever loved him. I don't think that I have ever loved anyone. I don't think that I ever liked him that much. He did most of the talking right from the start. He never wanted to hear about my interests or hobbies, or what I wanted out of life." She felt more confident talking about it now. She knew that at the end of the day none of this mattered, as it couldn't hurt her now. She told him how she had sleptwalked through the marriage, and how for the first 2 years she had played at being the good wife, with the cooking and cleaning, but then Duncan had started pressuring her to start a family, and she had balked at the idea. She withdrew into herself like she had done when she was a child, when her mother harassed and dictated to her. Then she'd lost herself in her writing and daydreaming. She talked about letting the housework go and how she took more and more days off work until finally she was fired due to job abandonment. Dr. Purdieu didn't interrupt, but let her continue with her story like a stream of consciousness, as he obviously knew that it was necessary in order to get as much out as possible before she clammed up again. "It got to the stage where I wouldn't even leave the house. For the last 2 years of the marriage I was a hostage in my own home. I was a zombie hiding in the spare room, only coming out when Duncan went to work. He was so hostile, and I can't blame him. But just one kind word, just one gesture of compassion, and I might have snapped out of it. She felt the tears coming, but no longer cared. This was the right place to let go. Then the narcolepsy got even worse, and the nightmares. I was taking all kinds of pills, but I didn't care. I was a mess. Then Duncan involved my family, but it was my mother who took charge. She called the CAT team in. They had me committed, but what made me smile was hearing her ask Duncan, "Don't you know how to clean?" And then she said, "What took you so long?" He stammered and freaked like the piss-weak bastard he is. She blew her nose on the tissues Dr. Purdieu handed her, but he still didn't speak. He only smiled as she laughed weakly at the memory. She explained that it had been a long road out of the spell in the dark forest, but that Dr. Boyd had at least helped her function enough to deal with the divorce. I actually hoped that my mother would finally be on my side when the divorce came through, but at my bedside when I was at the psych unit, she whispered icily in my face, "You're on your own now. You have no one to blame but yourself." With that, she turned on her high heels and went clickety-clack down the white corridor, propelling her stick frame along like an animated corpse. Delwyn felt the frost creep over her with the memory of her mother rudely pushing past a nurse, lighting a cigarette in her haughty fashion, nose stuck up in the air. Delwyn hadn't bothered crying, as the pilot light in her heart had long been extinguished. Dr. Purdieu laughed and said, "You certainly have a way with words, Delwyn." She sniggered and retrieved her water bottle from her handbag. "So, have you spoken to your mother since then?" She couldn't help being snarky. "What do you think?" "Then that's a no," he scribbled in his notebook. "How about your father?" She rolled her eyes and said, "Look, he's married again and stopped caring about me a long time ago. I don't want to talk about him, okay?" He looked at her for a while and cocked his head for emphasis, pointing his pen at her. "Okay for now, but you know we will need to cover it at some stage." She reacted like a spoiled teenager and slumped in her chair, making them both laugh. "It's good to see you've retained your sense of humour. That can see you through some dark times." He stopped smiling and gave her a look that said, "Time to get serious." "Are you still writing?" "Oh yes, all the time." "Just in your journals?" "Mostly." "Are you happy at your aunt's place?" "Oh, very much so," she beamed. "So you don't mind being away from the city?" "No, I love it." She was perky now, which didn't go unnoticed. "So, what are your plans?" That stumped her. Plans. The word stood in front of her, or rather loomed in front of her like a mammoth monolith, a gigantic concrete slab with graffiti that said, "Have to" or "must do." She knew what she wanted to do, which was to stay at Gwen's and to write and continue exploring the dream world. She also wanted to see if she could gain some understanding of her sleep disorders and OBEs, or astral travelling, to see if there was really something to them. She knew that she should go along with Gwen's desires and package it up nicely for the doctor, but her stubborn streak wouldn't allow it. She simply responded with a shrug and said, "Get better, I suppose." He smiled and closed his notebook, signalling that the session was over. "Well, hopefully we can help you with that." She smiled and said, "I hope so." After briefly discussing her medication and giving her a prescription for something new, which apparently would not interfere with her sleeping patterns or narcolepsy, she walked out to meet up with Gwen. Waving goodbye to Dr. Purdieu, she crossed the road and went up the track and over the blonde hummocks to get to her aunt, who was just a dot on the horizon, walking up the beach. Delwyn had so much energy she ran all the way up to her and yelled, "Auntie Gwen!" Her aunt was startled and nearly dropped the shells and driftwood she was collecting. "Oh, Delwyn, don't do that, you silly girl!" They laughed and Delwyn threw her arms around her. Gwen hugged her back. "So he was good?" Delwyn wasn't giving anything away. She just nodded and smiled as they walked back to the car. She felt more hopeful than she had for a long time, but at the same time was fearful for the safety of her secret life. As she'd advised herself in her purple journal, she needed to be guarded about the mirror, her sleep disorders and astral travels, as deep down inside she somehow knew that these were an integral part of her psyche's need for escape. Without these portals, there was nowhere to run to. As they drove back, Gwen tried to politely engage Delwyn, knowing that it was a sore point, seeing as she'd literally forced her via an ultimatum to attend the session. "Well, I hope that was helpful for you." Delwyn stared out of the window at the raindrops, stubbornly holding onto the glass against the speed of the car. The grey day seemed fitting and aligned itself well with Delwyn's shifting mood that was now overcast and holding back her emotions. As the grassy hills of the beach raced by, she heard Gwen sigh quietly in defeat, obviously realising that there was no use pursuing any conversation about the session. As they approached the town of Sale, Gwen brightened up and announced that it might be nice to stop for tea at Wilford's Cafe. Delwyn shrugged but said, "Okay," which was enough to put a smile on her aunt's face. Even though Delwyn was being petulant, she was taking steps in the right direction, and Gwen obviously felt confident that finally this time the penny would drop and she'd break through to the other side. Of what, she wasn't sure, but anything would be better than the adolescent downward spiral that Delwyn had been riding for the past 10 years. As they pulled into the car park, the wind picked up and seemed to force Delwyn back into her seat. She laughed and opened the door again, surprised to see Greg run up and hold it open for her. He was in his work clothes, holding his hat against his chest, laughing as the sporadic rain hit his head and plastered his sandy hair against his sunburnt forehead. "Thanks, Greg," she said as she climbed out of the car into the blustery weather, allowing him to help her get to the door of the cafe. Gwen had already barged in without looking back and had found a table. Delwyn's head was still swimming with the ideas, memories and revelations that had surfaced during her session with Dr. Purdieu, but now she had a flood of thoughts regarding the possibilities with Greg. The concept of a full-blown relationship was still totally foreign to her, but the primal side of her was stirring in the presence of her childhood friend. He seemed to be struggling to say something as she reached for the handle of the door, so she asked if he wanted to join them. He smeared his face with his hand, looking earnest and hopeful. "Oh, no thanks, I've got to go and help Mr. Stevenson with one of his bulls, but I do want to ask you something." For some reason, Delwyn felt fear rising in her throat. "Oh, really?" She blushed and noticed that she was keeping a firm grip on the door handle. He smiled one of his Cheshire cat smiles. "Yeah, I was going to ask if maybe you want to come over for dinner one night." She looked up at his friendly, handsome face, open in that unaffected country way. She smiled and nodded, probably just out of politeness, but feeling the hint of desire prowling in her nether regions. "Yeah, okay, it'll be nice to catch up." "Great, I'll call you." He reached out and squeezed her arm reassuringly, almost gratefully. She hastily pulled away and stepped into the cafe, throwing a rueful smile over her shoulder at him. She saw his kind green eyes gazing attentively at her as she turned to meet up with her aunt. Wilford's Cafe hadn't changed much since the 1950s, and the menu was the same as when Delwyn was a child in the late 80s. Fish and chips, hamburgers, dim sims, potato cakes, souvlakis, meat pies, sausage rolls, milkshakes and spiders, as well as coffee and tea were the standard fare. Children were constantly streaming in and out like a thread throughout time, buying lollies, ice cream and icy poles, drinks and chips, laughing and jeering the same way, as though the needle was stuck on the same record for eternity, looped for the sake of continuity. There were always elderly people in the corner, sipping endless cups of coffee or tea, watching the streets with interest and chattering about times gone by. As Delwyn pretended to study the menu, Gwen rolled her hair up into a tidy bun and secured it with a hairpin, obviously itching to ask her niece about her session, but more interested in the conversation she'd had with Greg. The proudly plump young waitress brought the tea and scones over that Gwen had ordered earlier and set it all down with a "There you go," before bustling back to the kitchen, humming happily as she went. "Hasn't Greg grown up to be a strapping young man?" Gwen said in a warm, cinnamon voice. Delwyn pretended that she had no idea what she meant and raised an eyebrow to illustrate as she squeezed her tea bags. Gwen continued, "Well, he used to be so scrawny and skinny, all arms and legs like a spider. Now he's filled out and quite good looking. I'm surprised he's not married." Delwyn took a sip of her tea and thought she'd tease her aunt. "Well, maybe he's a shirt lifter." "Oh, Delwyn," Gwen said with mock horror, but then collapsed into giggles. "Surely not, you evil girl. He just hasn't found the right woman." Delwyn spooned some jam onto her scone and then grunted and shrugged, suddenly deciding that she wasn't going to buy into whatever her aunt was trying to herd her into. "He's still a pest." Gwen balked and dropped her spoon in the saucer for emphasis. "Pest? He was such a gentleman, helping you out of the car and to the cafe door. Honestly, I just don't get you bloody modern women." Delwyn was surprised with Gwen's sudden outburst. She was usually so quiet and guarded. As she swallowed a mouthful of scone, blackberry jam and cream, she tried to find the right response. But Gwen continued, "You know, I'm not the one to preach, girlie, but after everything that's happened, I'd consider myself extremely lucky to have a man of Greg's caliber paying attention to me." Gwen started scooping jam out of the jar in a mild temper, furtively glancing around to see if anyone was listening to her minor tirade. Delwyn tried to control her temper and the volume of her voice. "He just helped me to the door. It was no big deal." She was lying, as she didn't want to let on that he had asked her out for dinner. It was only now that it dawned on her how odd it was that he hadn't invited her out to a restaurant, but rather to his place for a meal. She wondered if it was due to gossip and not wanting to be seen in public with a crazy woman, if word had reached this neck of the woods, but she was forgetting about his father. Gwen swallowed her food and then gulped a mouthful of tea, obviously trying to retain some composure. "I saw the way he looked at you. Oh, God, I hope you don't hurt that poor soul." Delwyn could feel the bile rising up in her throat. "So you do think that I'm to blame? You think I'm a complete fuck-up?" Gwen frantically looked around to see if anyone had heard the eruption, but suddenly Delwyn got up and said through gritted teeth, "Don't worry, I won't embarrass you any further. I'll be out the front." She did her best not to slam the door as she stormed out, but stomped her feet down the footpath like a child in tantrum to the bench further down the street. There she sat and fumed, trying to dodge the waves of rain, blasted by the gusts of wind. Her grandma used to say that this kind of weather was dirty. She missed her grandma and grandpa. They were on her mother's side, and she'd been closer to them than she'd ever been with her parents. They'd adopted her mother, who had never shown any appreciation to them and treated them worse than lepers. They could never explain to Delwyn why she'd become so bitter and twisted, or what had happened to her real parents. Even Gwen didn't know. Her grandparents had been two peas in a pod, but definitely two vastly different variety of pea in the same pod. Her grandpa had been much like Delwyn, and she'd often wondered if that was where she'd got her dreamy nature from, even though they weren't blood relatives. He was always, as they used to say, off with the fairies. He had been fascinated with people from other cultures and foreign places, and was always asking questions about how people lived and what they had for breakfast and so on. One of his favourite questions to ask Delwyn had been, "Do you think it's hot in Hottentot?" Not meaning to be offensive, as he thought that it was a place somewhere far away, not a racist name for the Khoikhoi. He would also tell her about his dreams and would ask her what they meant. Once he dreamt about a giant snail having a shower in his bathroom, wearing a shower cap. Towards the end, he was obsessed with dying and kept asking her if she believed in life after death. She'd never wanted to lie and say no, so she'd say yes to try to make the transition easier for him, but hated lying just the same. Her grandma had possessed a wicked sense of humour, yet could snap and turn nasty at the drop of a hat. Delwyn had often wondered if maybe that was where her mother had picked up some of her behaviour. Her grandma would have funny ways of saying things like, "I'll smack your legs until your nose bleeds," or "She's got a face like a smack bottom." Still, she missed them both, especially now, and especially seeing as her parents were of no comfort to her. Now it seemed that her aunt was about to turn on her as well.